Parshat Chayei Sarah. I know this has been talked about in prior weeks, and certainly something that speaks for itself in the cadence and in the texture, in the architecture, in the structure, and in the language of Sefer Bereshit, certainly through this point, and will continue throughout Sefer Bereshit. But the idea is that everything that we read and everything that we see can certainly be taken at face value, is also templatized because it is certainly meant to create not just a foreshadowing, but to solidify an enduring agent for how we are meant to approach various situations, circumstances, political, diplomatic, economic, certainly family dynamics, parents, children, siblings, that everything that we read about really creates a template and an approach for us to be able to arm ourselves with the tools and with the right understanding about the things that we're going to need in order to progress through life. There are many mafarshim, many commentators that talk about the importance of this dynamic, namely, and first and foremost, the Ramban, who talks about and nicknames Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer of creation, the book of creation, which we know, if we take that definition in a very literal sense, then creation is really only the first couple of chapters of the book of Genesis, but really Sefer Yetzirah as an entity and as a concept and as a construct extends through the entire book, as we see represented through dynamics, through economics, through diplomacy, through conversation, through tribal interactions, certainly again through family. So everything we read, we cannot just read at face value, but to double click, triple click, and go into the well and into the recesses of what it is the Torah is trying to help us dialogue with, convey, and certainly withstands the test of time. So everything we read about is from that filter and from that vantage point. And certainly Parshat Chayei Sarah is no exception. So in the opening of the Parsha of Chayei Sarah, we know that the name of the Parsha is Chayei Sarah, which means the life of Sarah, and in fact begins with her death, which in and of itself, the Torah is already telling us something incredibly important about life and what we're meant to understand from life, even in death. So working backwards, the most important things we're going to ever need to know, we learn at the end of our lives. So at that being kind of the nth degree, the bookend of the end really helps to inform the way we're meant to live. So Chayei Sarah, even though the story is about her death, tells us everything, A, about her life, B, about the approach to death, to mourning, and to legacy, and what it means to have something for duration, something that outlives our specific time in this world. So just that as an opening, and the moniker, and the fact that it's called Chayei Sarah, already is giving us a certain sense of direction and a certain sense of understanding. So already coming in, there's a depth and a nuance about this contrast and contraction between life and death. With that in mind, we see the very first real estate transaction in the book of Genesis, and certainly the most famous one. So by way of background, I worked for Westfield in real estate development for 15 years. I ran the World Trade Center retail development in Lower Manhattan, the Oculus, if anybody's ever been there. So understanding kind of the constructs around the real estate transaction, how do you create something for duration? What does a place look like when it is now wrapped in sanctity, and it is wrapped also in legacy, and wrapped with transaction, and wrapped with currency? So we start to take all of these kind of micro and macro factors and features, and we're bringing them and surrounding them around something sacred or a conversation that's about to take place. So in the beginning of the conversation that Abraham has with Ephron, there's a very interesting, with the representatives, there's an interesting conversation and dialogue that goes back and forth. And we'll read some of it inside and bring in some of the commentaries to help animate and help to root some of these concepts, that they're not just looked at from a translation standpoint, but really from a transmission standpoint. What is it that the Torah wants us to discern, and the myriad of vantage points that we're meant to learn from this, not just as something that took place one-off in history, but something that is really meant to be a prototype and something that is meant to be a roadmap for how we're meant to approach and to think when it comes to legacy, when it comes to duration, and when it comes to covenant. So in the beginning, we know that Abraham comes, it says, Lispod Sarah ulivkota. He first gives her the dignity and the honor that is deserved for her, and his own space for mourning, and his own space for understanding, and for the quiet, for eulogizing out loud and eulogizing internally. And what does he do? Vayakam Abraham. Abraham gets up. Number one, he gets up, there is a time and place for mourning, and there's a time and place for motion forward. And to bring our fractures, to bring our pain, and to bring sometimes the brokenness that we have or that we've experienced, and not to discard that, not to leave that, and at the same time be able to get up and to move and to bring those scars with us. So what does he do? Vayakam Avraham me'al pnei meto. He gets up and he comes to Bnei Chet. The first thing he says, and what we'll do is we'll look at, again, some of the text and then be able to pull out some core thematics that will be applicable beyond just the historical facet, but how these are applicable certainly in our day-to-day lives. So what does he say? Avraham gets up, he goes to Bnei Chet, he says, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. He gives himself the title of Ger v'toshav, which means I am both a resident and a sojourner. I belong and I also don't. And I have certain values that I embody that might or might not mix with the cultural symphony of what I'm surrounded by. So he already starts to convey the friction and the healthy tension that exists within his own framework, within his own existence. I'm a person of value and I'm at the workplace. I'm a person of integrity, of monotheistic understanding, and I also find myself among non-believers. How do I start to feel and to reconcile and to build and to create and to live optimally within that friction? So already he's painting for us a dynamic and a language that we can start to adopt and adapt to understand what does it mean to hold residence and to hold permanent residence with both of these concepts, to feel comfortable and also a little uncomfortable, to feel native and to feel like a visitor and to feel like somebody who's new to the game. And understanding the dynamics and the interplay between that and what he's conveying with these two simple words really sets off the identity for Jewish trajectory from here on in. Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. That's point number one. And what does he say? Tnuli achuzat kever imachem ve'ekbara meitzim alfanai. Give me lands, give me a place where I can bury, which tells you about the dignity of death, how we deal with kedusha, how we deal with sanctity even in death, and that again informs how we live. If we go to the nth degree to perform dignity and nobility and kindness and chesed at the end of one's life, how much more so a fortiori kal v'chomer, that it's meant to inform how we live every single day. So what do they answer? They say, Shemanu Adoni, Nisi Elohim ata b'tochenu, b'mivchar kivarenu kivor et metzcha, ish mimenu et kivro lo yuchla mimecha, mikvor metecha. What is bury your dead? We're brothers, we're friends, we're neighbors. What's between us? We're certainly not going to object. Right there, Avraham, the negotiator, we think of him as the monotheist, which he is. We think of him as a man of God, which he is. We think of him as somebody with awe and wonder and respect of God and a person who's able to embody and convey that, which he is. What does he hear and what does he say? He's a chief negotiator. He is unbelievable. What does he hear them say? He says, Ish mimenu. None of us are going to contend this. Bury your dead. What does he hear in the word mimenu? That's the tell. Everything you need to hear in a negotiation. Us. We will not contend. So what does Avraham hear? Oh, you, but you're not speaking for your children. You're not speaking for the next generation or for the tribe that's going to take over. You're speaking for yourselves in a single moment in time. So Avraham hears this and it's like, no. We're not, this will not be, we cannot enter into this type of transaction. We cannot enter into this type of partnership. We cannot enter into this type of friendship without it being rooted with an understanding that this is for duration, right? So I think about Simon Sinek, infinite games and finite games. He's like, you guys are playing finite, I'm playing infinite. So already there we start to see that Avraham, by the way, as we all know, precedes Simon Sinek. So a lot of this rhetoric and discussion and industry intel is really drawn from its origin story in the Torah. So ish mimenu, none of us are going to contend with this. Parenthetically, we cannot speak for anyone else but ourselves. So Avraham, in an effort to future-proof this transaction, to future-proof the dignity of his wife, of burial, to future-proof something that will not be able to be contended, that he has to then proceed to go into this negotiation. And then the two of them, they bring in Ephron, and then there starts to become this back and forth, this dynamic of what's it between us. And then, of course, Ephron offers, and he says it's 400 shekel, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. The current value of that is probably like $500 million, right? So there's, like, if we think about what he was charging at the time, and in fact, throughout Talmudic literature, there are a couple of different times where the Talmud will hint to something. Anytime you have an exaggerated number, it uses the number 400. So it's like, oh my gosh, there were 400 of this, 400 bottles of wine. You're like, what was the 400? That's meant to say like, oh, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000. So it's that type of exaggerated number. So when we see that number actually hit concrete words that reserve itself in perpetuity in the Torah, that number 400 is not just an amount that we're meant to weigh against current value. That is an amount that was exorbitant. So all of a sudden, the conversation went from, we're friends, you take it, no one's going to contest this land. And Abraham, of course, then says, no, I want to pay for it. It's like, okay, well, what's 400 shekel? 400 shekel? That's like a 20x multiple on what the land is actually worth, and what the site is actually worth. So we read it, and we need to give it the airtime and the space to understand what that number really represents. It is an insane price. An absolutely insane market price that's so far beyond market value, or something that any CFO is going to be able to justify. This is an unjustifiable price, and of course, Abraham goes through with the transaction. So a couple of key points, and we'll start to dissect and uncover some of the features here. At the end of this section, it uses a very interesting word to describe, or two words to describe Abraham, his reputation, and his currency. And it uses the words over lasocher. This is at the very end of the negotiation. So understanding that there is real estate in the Torah devoted to this back and forth is area number one. That's tell, reveal number one, right? Because the Torah could easily just said Abraham bought it for 400 shekel and leave out the whole negotiation. The negotiation is critical for us to understand in perpetuity. How this went about. What assets are you really protecting? What does legacy mean? What does duration mean? What's finite? What's infinite? And how do we approach this with dignity and with integrity and with respect? So already the 16 psukim that are devoted to this interaction already outweighs even the Akedat Yitzchak that we read in last week's Parsha. We only have 12 psukim devoted to that. And here we need all the banter back and forth in perpetuity to read year after year. In this section, the answer is yes. This transaction is critical to understand. So number one, the amount of real estate that's devoted to this topic tells us everything we need to know about this real estate and the real estate transaction. Number one. Number two, at the end of the section, so we have your opening statement and your closing statement. The opening statement is about Chayei Sarah. Our closing statement is over lasocher. So what does Abraham do? He gives Vayishkol Abraham leEphron et hakesef. He pays out the money to Ephron asher diber ba'aznei bnei Chet. Everything as he said to bnei Chet. So this is, you talk about like M&A, what needs to be documented, what needs to be in the public sphere, the public space. Everything Abraham said is everything that Abraham delivered. He didn't just pay for the transaction. You see all the steps going backwards. It was everything that he promised to bnei Chet. Arba me'ot shekel kesef over lasocher. And it ends with these very interesting words, in a merchant's currency. So one of the questions that's asked, like, what? We don't need those two extra words. The transaction took place. We know it was negotiated. We can hear through the gift of retrospect what Abraham heard at the time, which is, nope, this has to be an indisputable territory. I need to pay for it, and I need to pay a multiple of it so that it is indisputable. And then it ends with these words, over lasocher. So one of the questions that's raised is, what do these words mean? All of the mafarshim, all of the commentaries, really throughout different regions and throughout different parts of Jewish history, band together with the following universal and thematic around Abraham. He was best in class. His currency was accepted everywhere. The backing of his currency was so strong that it surpassed all other markets and all other economies and all other geographies. The power of his currency was so strong that it was universally accepted. By the way, we don't have a comp, maybe the US dollar, but we don't have really a comp in that respect, because it wasn't just that it was accepted universally. So there was something about the rating of his currency, about the transparency of his currency and the reputation of his currency that was for all. And that's not just something that's represented on the transaction side. That tells you everything that Abraham stood for. He was a person that walked into a room, so to speak. He's a proverbial room. He's a person that could walk into any geography, that could walk into any tribe, that could walk into any conversation, into any tent, into any city. Over lasocher. everything that he was, everything that he represented was backed by the eternity of integrity, by the eternity of godliness. Everything he was, that was the backing of his currency. And that was universally accepted, even if people were of other faith, even if people were of other opinions and other understanding, and even if they were on the other side of a transaction, he was universally accepted. That is a remarkable understanding, especially when you think about the volatility of markets and the volatility of value of currency and how much that fluctuates and moves. I know that some people, at least Rabbi Benji's in Israel, right? Every day is like, we're up, we're down, we're up, we're down. Like, for the Americans that come, it's like, how strong is my US dollar today? When we travel to Australia, how strong is my dollar? Everything is about that. Avraham's currency was locked in. The Gemara actually takes us a step further. Not just the fact that his currency was locked in and was universally accepted, which means it was backed by the ultimate, which means it was something in perpetuity and something that's infinite. It was backed by God, by God's integrity, by his moral standing in the world, by the way he approached his values and his conversations and his relationships. That was the backing. It was the integrity and the moral construct and the conduct with which he operated. That was the backing of his universal currency. But the Mefarshim, and particularly the Gemara in Bava Metzia, says as follows. It takes the concept of over lasocher to the next level. And the Gemara says as follows. What was imprinted on Avraham's coins, on Avraham's currency, right? This is a very famous Gemara, right? When you think about the US dollar, what does it say? In God we trust, right? And you have different pictures, different depictions. If you start to do like a forensic study, not just of today's currency, but currency of the past, what is it that a culture puts on their coin? What is it that they are willing to stamp that serves as kind of the visual formation of a person's transaction, of a person's commerce, of a person's covenant? What do you put on your coin? So the Gemara says as follows: Zakein v'zekena mitzad echad, ubachor ubetula mitzad acher. One side had an older couple. We call it the grandparents, the zakenim, right? So you have an old man and an old woman on one side of the coin, and on the other side of the coin, you had a young woman and a young man, which in and of itself tells you everything about Avraham's approach to transacting, Avraham's approach to culture, and Avraham's understanding about his role in the world. Everything is about paying homage to the past and about fulfilling a promise to the future. Every decision on that coin is made with that vantage point in mind. Everything that came before me, we stand on the shoulders of giants. We are composites of every part of history that comes before us, every part that we're supposed to learn from, down to our DNA. We are composites of what came before us, and we're also the progenitors of what's going to come after us. We're borrowing the world. We're borrowing the world from our children. So how is it that we're going to not only preserve, but leave it for them intact, for them to be able to then become custodians of the future, to preserve the future, to build and to create and economy and to scale and to magnify and to bring all of those values and all of those attributes and all of the possibility around building? How do you start to fortify that for the future while you're also paying homage to the past? While we also never stop looking in the rearview mirror of our history, because that really tells you exactly where you stand. So in Avraham's currency, this whole transaction has nothing to do with the real estate. The real estate is the part that we can hold on to. We have a title, we have a deed, by the way, to a highly contended part of Israel, of course, with Il Hebron. But leaving the details of that aside, this is not just about a title and a deed. This is telling us about what Avraham heard, what he was able to discern, the listening that he had in the conversation. It tells us everything about Ger v'Toshav, his standing in a society, know where you stand and understand the vulnerabilities and the exposure and the risk. Number 3, that he understands the arc of what his currency represents, and it is his brand, literally his brand, and he represents God. He's the representative of monotheism, which means that every single part of what he transacts with, every part of who he interacts with, is going to be a representation of God, and that is infinite, and that is for duration, and that is an enduring feature, and that is the backing of his currency. And number 4, the currency itself manifests and represents this visual of having this old couple on one side and this young couple on the other side, which tells you everything about how he thinks. Every decision. What would happen if our decisions were all made from that vantage point? What would happen if we started to think about a society, not just about the future, but understanding everything from the past and not getting too lost in the past that we become handicapped or crippled from being able to make decisions about moving forward? What would our landscape look like if that was our currency? What would our landscape look like if our currency was backed by moral integrity that is infinite and was meant and built for duration? What does that start to look like? And when Avraham engages in this, he's teaching us with such depth, such sincerity, and such care, all the different aspects that we need to be thinking about and incorporating into our thinking and understanding, from the most and biggest transactions that really are moments of transformation, down to the day-to-day negotiations we have with our kids or with our spouses or with our community or with understanding how to deal with the threats of the outside world. Everything and anything in between, these 16 psukim animate for us the contextual understanding about what it means to move from commerce to covenant, what it means to move from an interaction to something that is transformative, what it means to deepen into the integrity and the value system and the architecture of self and understanding, and what that means vis-a-vis the mundane, bein kodesh l'chol, right? We have these two counterpoints. What is sacred? What is sanctified? What is infinite? What is regular? What is mundane? And what is finite? And how do we start to infuse our moments of over la socher? How do we start to take what does currency mean? When you remove volatility from currency, what stands? What is represented? The values and the integrity that back that currency, everything that tells you everything that it needs to stand for. And when you start to paint and take this as a concept and understanding based purely on the psukim, purely on the verses that are in the Torah, and then we start to layer in the different voices of the commentaries, it starts to paint this unbelievable picture of both the past, the present, and the future. The Sforno talks about the power of independence, that if you take something out of the friendship realm, or really understanding what are the constructs of friendship, because B'nai Chet and Ephron were like, we're friends. Can't we just do this as friends? Handshake, we love each other. What does it mean to sever from that? Not in a way that you discard or reject the other, but you incorporate with a sense of independence. What does that start to look like? These are such valuable insights and such valuable reveals about how Avraham is thinking, because the relationship might not be intact in the way that we think about it. Normalization might not sustain in a particular region. So how do you future-proof? How do you future-proof your insurance policy against the things that you can't foresee? So how do we start to deal with a society for the things we can't see and the things that we know are true, for the things that are finite, and incorporating and infusing the things that are infinite? So the Sforno talks about the power of independence, and the gift would create dependency, and certainly a real transaction creates the element and the virtues of independence. The Netziv brings down that this is a moment of Kiddush Hashem, and this goes back to the concept of over la socher, the power of that currency. Any moment that we have to be Makadesh Shem Hashem, to sanctify the name of God, it is criminal not to use and leverage and access those moments. That is the asset. We think the asset is Ma'aretz Machpelah, the real estate. No, the asset is that this was a moment of enduring Kiddush Hashem, of saying, this is what I stand for. How was that represented? Through the material, through the currency, because the currency represents everything that God is. This was a moment of Kiddush Hashem. And not to take those moments for granted, and not just not to take them for granted, and God forbid to miss those sacred moments, but maybe even to create those sacred moments. At the workplace, any interactions that we have in the street, in Yanei Diyoma, just in day-to-day conversation on the things that are happening. How do we start to infuse that? And in the as the section ends, and it ends with those words, over la socher, which we'll come back to in a moment, the very next pasuk, it's very interesting how the Torah, the orientation, the curation, the mapping, and the structure of the Torah tells you everything. How one verse then goes into the next verse, the power of juxtaposition, what you can learn and what you can infer from one idea to the next. After it says the words, over la socher, what does it say? Vayakam sedei Ephron. And it stood. And it stood for duration. How did the section open? Vayakam Avraham. He gets up from mourning his wife. So we have bookends for this entire section as well. The bookends are Vayakam. He gets up from his mourning. He gets up from his pain. He takes the fractures of what is missing and what is painful in his life. He brings them with him. He's able to think through with discernment, not about what he needs today and not about what he wants today, but understanding the power of duration and the power of everything that he is seeding at scale in perpetuity. And how do you start to discern and to listen in between friendship and not friendship, dependence, independence, ger v'toshav. He's giving us the textured conversation and these two counterpoints that we start to dance and we start to create within these frameworks. So he says ger v'toshav. So you have vayakam. He gets up from his wife and it's established for eternity, for duration. Ger v'toshav, the two counterpoints of the way in which we need to approach our lives on a day-to-day basis, not just in our relationship with our fellow society, but even within ourselves, to feel the sense of comfort, the sense of warmth, the sense of belonging, and at the same time, a sense of awe, a sense of reverence, and a sense of growth. So how can you be comfortable and grow at the same time? Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. So we have vayakam as bookends. We have ger v'toshav, which is certainly an important indicator about the way of approaching life, the way of approaching society, ourselves, our family, our relationships, and then how that moves into over lasocher. How does that start to translate into our currency? Currency is not just an exchange of dollars or money. Currency is about we have spiritual currency, we have social currency. There are ways that we show up, that we quote unquote transact in the world, how we dialogue, how we convey, how we converse, the intimacy of our relationships. All of that is our currency. That is who we are. What backs our currency? Are we living a life? Are we conducting ourselves in a way that is universally accepted? That anybody can look at it from any vantage point, and either you see an image of an old couple on one side and a young couple of another side, and it is universally accepted because this is enduring integrity. This is something that will withstand the test of time. And again, when we start to paint with the other mafarshim and how the other commentators bring the story to life, that we understand this and why the importance of having all of this real estate devoted to the real estate transaction and what it is that we're really trying to convey. There's an idea of reputational capital, right? And due diligence, and the importance of what Avraham brought to the table, and the idea of transparency of governance into unimpeachable integrity. How Avraham was able to thread that line and to build this eternal thematic where you change commerce into covenant. And this starts to happen through the following ways that were just dictated and outlined in the Torah. Vayakam are the bookends. We get up, we move, without fear and with immense, tremendous humility. That is what's going to create the bookends of duration. Vayakam is we take and we move and we grow from within even the pain. Vayakam, and that becomes established at the end. Ger v'toshav are the two elements that create the healthy tension and the friction through which motion is possible. You need both of those aspects to bring that motion. And again, a double term, over lasocher, a universally recognized currency that is immovable, that is outside of market volatility, that represents duration and represents the integrity and the values that back that durability, and what's represented on the coins, which is a promise to the past and a promise to the future. So again, when we start to stack all of these concepts and these constructs together, and we start to pull and excavate what it is that Avraham was really seeding, he was telling us everything that we need to know about ourselves, about society, about value, about the infinite game versus the finite game. Sorry, Simon Sinek. The infinite game versus the finite game, and what it means to live for duration and to create a system and a structure that is enduring forever. So as we read the Torah, it brings to life in such a profound and such a pronounced way the architecture of self, the architecture of dignity, the architecture of durability, and the architecture of the infinite. So this is, a bit of an insight into this week's Torah portion. And of course, again, going back to the name, this is Chayei Sarah. If we understand how we deal and how we construct and how we negotiate at times of death, this should tell us everything and should inform about every part of how we live.